All right, we appear to be live. Just a make sure test and such. Yes, so tested. We passed the test. Yay. So, anyway, I did get a couple of responses regarding the experiment. And yeah, I don't know if they're very good. One guy hasn't emailed me back. We'll see. So anyway, this Lab 37 guy might as well promote his channel or whatever. You know, he does some interesting experiments. But I don't know if he's doing them to a quality, that I'm sort of going to need to prove the point. And the comment he left was just kind of strange. So he says, I can help you. And then he comments to his own comment, check out my channel. I can help you disprove your current theory. It's not really what I'm trying to do. A viewer of yours sent me the job offer. Okay, so you didn't bother watching the video, I guess. I have done a lot of research in wireless electricity. Well, you haven't done that much. And, this whole idea that, yes, you can transmit, um, you know, you can transmit, it's hard to say. You're not really transmitting electricity, but I mean that you can provoke electricity in something at a distance. Yeah, it's not a big surprise. The photoelectric effect, essentially. Yes. So the idea is photons hit something, the something can cause an electrical current. And clearly you can do that with radio waves. But the amount of energy you put in and the amount you transmit is tiny by percentage. So you put 1,000 watts in and you transmit 2 watts worth of that 1,000. Not a very good ratio. I have a few videos you can watch. Yes, I did watch some. If you would like me to build your basic device that could disprove your theory. So again, I don't know what this, maybe you don't speak English. I don't know what the thing is. I mean, obviously, I'm not trying to disprove my theory. I'm trying to disprove their theory. Um, and so, I mean, it's sort of a wrong way to start if we can't agree on what the words were, prove and disprove mean. I would be happy to. Hopefully, we can negotiate an offer. Well, I sort of made an offer, but whatever. Yeah, and the offers for something a little better than you can't just rip a microwave gun out of a microwave oven. You could make 2 metal slits, I suppose, use a microwave oven and actually make 2 slits and do the experiment the slit way. But to be the real proof, I think you're going to have to probably do the experiment so you can do it both ways. So if you measure it at a frequency, you can show that there are the on-off pattern, and then just show that it isn't photon plus photon equals no photon. It's just that the 2 signals are jammed, and you can just prove that the voltage remains constant across the whole area. So this amount of signal reaching each spot is the same amount of signal. And the only thing that changes is your ability to receive, tune this signal. You can't tune it at certain locations because it's being jammed. So, but anyway, we sort of have to agree on what's going to be proven or demonstrated. And so we'll see. See how it goes. Maybe I'll just have to buy the shit and do it myself. But we'll see. And this guy said, what you said about the guy in the comments was totally uncalled for. So it's sort of a nothing statement. Says you, I can just say that. There's not an argument in there except for you saying so. So, and I would just mock your comment as, so what's uncalled for? You don't think people who deliberately lie and play games like fake identities and then have fake conversations, say things that don't really mean just to fool people into getting into a comment stream with them. So you don't think deception and those kind of distractions, which isn't any better than going to a theater and heckling, or going to a movie and standing up and mocking the movie while the movie's playing. You don't think that kind of behavior should basically people should throw rocks at that person until they're dead? I think they should. I think that would be the rational response when somebody's just overtly taking a shit in your front lawn. Yeah, there's no excuse. You just shoot them. It's perfectly acceptable behavior to shoot them. There's just no excuse for it. So stuff there's no excuse for, why should there be any tolerance for it? I mean, we really should have the zero tolerance for people who deliberately, on purpose, attempt to waste other people's time. That should be like in the Constitution. That should be like one of the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not deliberately waste anyone's time. Fight a fair fight. Don't fight a liar's fight, a fake fight, play some cheater's game. You get your free speech. I'll have my free speech. You don't try to interrupt my speech. You just take your own podium and make your own little speeches. That's the way to play the game fair. If somebody can't manage those basic rules, why should anyone tolerate that? How could anything be uncalled for under those circumstances? Deliberately wasting another person's time. I just like, if you could come up with an answer, it'd be interesting. But I mean, this nothing comment. You say so. I mean, in what way should we be tolerant? Why? Just tell me why I should think otherwise. I mean, the guy has routinely, 3 different comments. He brings up this women's studies thing, as if I defend women's studies in college anyway, which I don't. And so he's just using this thing as a vehicle for some running joke of his. Why should anybody accept that? I don't know. Too stupid. So this guy kind of fails. Dude, well, you already lost me right there. You lost me at dude. I'm not your dude, not your bro, not any of that crap. Fuck you. You are a fucking genius. Well, says the guy who calls other people dude. Doesn't, you're not much of an authority in my opinion. Don't stop what you do, man. Well, I'm not going to be doing that. I'm not your man either. Finally, something about the double slit that is thought about with a we must be wrong about this. I wouldn't do the we thing because obviously I wouldn't say we must be. Obviously they must be. So I didn't fall for it. All right. So he says this could be tested. Do the single slit test. I don't really need to. It's been done a billion times. But don't put it in the middle. Well, a laser beam covers the whole thing anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Leave it at the same offset as if it were double. Really wouldn't make a difference. Won't prove anything. So when Einstein was asked, how does it feel to be the smartest man on earth? He responded, don't ask me, ask Tesla, who was right. So again, see, this is the problem with quote mining dead people and shoving words in their mouth and, ignoring the fact that they retracted something later in their life or clarified it. And people just don't want to play fair. They just abuse the dead all over the place. Einstein made it clear he was an atheist. And he also made it clear that he didn't consider himself the smartest man on earth. And so he wouldn't accept a question phrased that way. And what is also clear is Tesla had a potty mouth and was talking like he was the smartest man on earth. And so Einstein was clearly just insulting Tesla. Clearly. So anyway, let's see. Great explanation of time dilation. Yes, it was a good explanation. So, Bill, useless F you, and that's funny. So, I mean, it's just no counter argument of how the explanation wasn't perfectly appropriate, how the analogy wasn't perfectly connected. Just more crap comments from crappy people who can't articulate a real argument. They can't manufacture a couple of sentences explaining why they're right. and why they have a right to be so fucking arrogant. Jesus. Let's see. Give me time, and I'll find somebody to argue with. You'll need to play nice. Yes, well, of course. I understand how to play nice when I have to. As long as I'm, as long as I'm not going to get insulted. Dang, I always miss these. Well, anyway, no need to read the positive things. Make one LED thing for me. Okay, so that was where we did that. All right, so never caught up on comments. Very exciting, wasn't it? Yep. Let's see if there's any chat crap. No one, nobody. Okay, hello, Amendum. I'm suffering so much in this shit existence. Again, this is not the room for this. I was born disabled. That's no good. And I lived an awful life. That's no good either. I just need to die, man. Okay, well, I'm really not in a position to help you die. You go to jail for that, I really appreciate what you're doing, though. Life is hell. Okay. Well, it's not really very physicsy. So anyway, I did a couple of subjects. I mean, there is always the Ken Wheeler crazy video. Could play one of those because he just keeps saying things that are just insanely mushy, inarticulate, no information value. All right, these are just the demos. Blah blah blah. I guess it's back here somewhere. So the other thing was, I watched I was watching some of this particle guru guy on Bob D. Hilster. And then there's the Franklin guy from this guy, Franklin Who. And he was talking about protons and neutrons, and he has this idea of them being connected, let's see, symmetrically or consistently in, I guess it's not going to play. There it is. All right, so he was using Legos as an example, but he was kind of arguing that the protons and the neutrons wouldn't be in the nucleus of the atom, but that they would be part of the structure of the atom. As the atom got bigger, it would have protons and neutrons all throughout as part of the building block infrastructure. I sort of like that idea, but something intuitively says that probably can't be right. And so I was just trying to think of some of the reasons that can't be right. And one that occurred to me that I'll have to pose to Franklin when I interact with him next. I have to write that down. Pen has failed to be pen-like. There's always something. I got a screwdriver stuck in the monitor, so I was having the monitor trouble. So I dug I took a knife and cut the button out. And then it was almost stayed on, and so then it wouldn't quite still stay on. So then I shoved a screwdriver into the on-off hole that was left, and it's actually staying on. So I guess the screwdriver will stay there for a while. But it's kind of funny, that screwdriver stuck in the monitor. Anyway, all right, Franklin. And so what I was thinking was that if you didn't have all the protons and the neutrons in the nucleus, then the alchemy thing would get really easy, because then you're really talking about clumps of material in like big atoms that would be the same structure molecularly as other elements. So it's like there'd be there'd be lithium inside, actual hunks of lithium inside of, say, radon or something, some heavy metal, and gold or whatever. And that, the alchemy thing would be so much simpler. We should just sort of break an atom and it would automatically break into 5 lithiums or something. So it would make alchemy really simple. And the reason why alchemy is really hard is because you do have to change the nucleus. And you can't just do the building block thing. You can't just add another atom. You have to add a bit in the nucleus, and you have to add bits out in the outside to expand an atom or change it. And so that's why you can't just alchemy your way to it. You can't just build your way, throw a couple of lithiums together and make gold. That kind of thing. So that was my reasoning. One reason why I think that would fail. All right. So if you have some other reasons, I'd be curious. But is it, you kind of want to make it, it's just a nice evolution where you can just, evolve the elements and just by adding stuff to the outside, but you really can't do it that way. It'd be nice if you could. So anyway, this particle model has a lot of problems. They have two kinds of force elements. Standard, what we call gravity, and then some sort of sub force that's some scale below gravity. I mean, it's like a force twice as small as the electromagnetic and the gravitational force that somehow bends light and stuff like that. And I think it's just totally unnecessary. And then the idea of photons that are made of a bunch of these little bits. So he has this second level of force, and then he has photons made of this second level force and a whole bunch of them. So one photon would be a million of these little things. And I just think that goes against, what is kind of obvious as a pretty well-established part of physics, is that these light quantities, these quantums of energy in the form of force, have a very consistent amount to them, very consistent weight. And I think you would lose your consistent weighting if you had a whole bunch of them and you could be bending or knocking them around. Doesn't seem to me to make much sense. It is a weird thing. I just don't know why they didn't think just to make like those little humps where there's more. Just make that's where the thing is, and there's another thing. He wanted to force photons to be waves, so he forced them to be a bunch of stuff waving. And there's just no reason to do that to a photon because of the whole quantum thing, where clearly they're so clumpy, as Feynman would put it. They're really clumpy, and they're not real wavy. They're clumpy more than they are wavy. They do more stuff like a clump than they do stuff like a wave. And the wave is just a bizarre phenomenon with this stupid two-slit nonsense. And this assumption that the photon has the power and that the matter isn't what's causing the effect, when it seems kind of obvious. You make an aperture smaller, the odds of the photon interacting closely with the surface go up. Yeah. It's not a coincidence. It's a material incidental fact, and that's what's causing the effect. Is you're more likely to go near the surface, and the surface is an active place that will cause you to be deflected in your motion. Seems such an obvious explanation, and there's no real good reason not to believe it. So he goes into some reflection and refraction, it's the standard thing where they talk about how fast, it's sort of the original old Huygens argument from back in the Newton day, that the reason why the light separates is because the light at the bigger wavelength I'll probably say this the wrong way, is bent more than the light at the smaller wavelength, because it goes slower in the material. So they did find that it actually moves through the material slower, but it's not because the actual photons are moving slower. It's because the photons are being converted through pressure. They're transferring their pressure through the electrons of the medium. So again, this idea that people see a transparent substance and they say, they think the photon's going right through it, like it wasn't there, and that somehow it's slowing down as it's going through something, quote unquote, but not the hard bits, it's not hitting anything. It's just somehow the glass is like molasses or something. When no, it's hard substance. It weighs as much as like aluminum or something, and it just happens to be transparent because of the way the atoms are arranged. And what's happening is that the photons aren't missing the substance; they're hitting it, and they're vibrating the little electrons. They hit an electron. The electron moves a little bit. That moves the force between the other next electron. That electron moves a little bit, and then the next electron moves a little bit. So it's the slowness of the electrons moving that accounts for the 40% degrade in the speed of light as the impulse moves through the transparency. So the speed change just has to do with the fact that electrons don't move as fast as photons, and the electrons are transmitting the pressure through the medium. So the photon hits an electron, and the electrons are basically rubber banding, expanding and contracting that pressure through the medium. And that takes a while because the electrons don't move the speed of light. And that's the simple explanation. In my opinion, simple enough. And it would also explain why at different frequencies, the amount of that difference would be different. Let's see how to say that. How to explain that. Well, I'll save that for another time because I have to think about it before I don't want to do that sloppy. But it's also there in the fact that when you're hitting electrons and you're moving the force between the electrons, if the electron has already moved when you hit it again, it's that whole, if I move something this far and it doesn't go back any, because it wants to go back, and I hit it again, see, I can go further distance, right? Because I get hit twice, so I can move further. But if it goes back, then I can't move quite as far. And so that's sort of the argument, is that even at the speed of light, the electron still moves back a little before it gets hit again, which means that there's not as proportional an amount of movement in the electrons. And that's accounting for the length of time it takes, because electrons don't move as far depending on the frequency. Less pressure, less voltage. So higher frequency electrons will create more pressure and therefore a faster transmission than slower, further apart photons, which will, the vibration will move slower because there'll be less pressure created between the electrons, less voltage. Higher voltage will move quicker, quote unquote. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Not a great deal, but it's just enough to make that difference in terms of the spreading of the red light versus the blue light. Well, the angle difference is a whole nother explanation, so I didn't even get into that. All right, so anyway, but I mean, this idea of photons being a whole bunch of stuff just doesn't fit in the sense that there just doesn't seem any probability that you'd end up with half photons, more photon, less photon. You'd end up with more stuff and less stuff. I don't think the medium could be in clumps reliably. It wouldn't be clumpy. It wouldn't be quantumly in clumps. This is a better way of saying that. All right, so let's see what else is news. I think that really covers it for the. So I guess we can just play. We should have one of these stupid documentaries on here. Photons attached to neutrons. Yeah, I did that. Yeah, so I could play some of this stupid Brian Greene thing. It's just so annoying, though. The propaganda. I guess I could start from the beginning. Let's see, Ken Wheeler or Brian Greene. Just don't know if Ken Wheeler matters because he says things that are just so uselessly overstated. You know, he's saying there's no attraction in magnetism. It's like, no, duh, they're attracting. Then he says, oh, no, well, they're attracting to some middle point between the two magnets or some kind of nutty crap like that. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense because he doesn't explain what's moving them anyway. How exactly do they move? No explanation. What's causing them to move? No explanation.
Is the electron right now?
So play along.
Coming up with this.
Yeah, so we'll play this maybe, just because it's just such a glorious pile of fucking propaganda. Just so bad, you know. And there's just no attention paid to any counter argument. But it's funny that these view numbers for this, the downvotes are much higher percentage than the upvotes than a Ken Wheeler video. So essentially, Ken Wheeler is more respected than Nova. Gets more respect. And that's kind of funny. But that might have more to do with just how the dissidents are. They're such a club. And maybe they're the type of people that do hit the thumb down button more than other normal people would. I mean, people who know Ken Wheeler's an asshole don't bother thumbing down his videos. But Ken Wheeler types do thumb down Nova videos. Maybe that kind of thing goes on.
Set of laws that describes the clear and certain motion of galaxies and stars and planets.
Right, and somehow connecting that with the subnuclear world, which is a huge mistake to make, because so if I was to do this, start this over, the first way to explain the universe is to explain there's only one universe. That's the truth. There's no big universe, and then there's this little universe. The little universe is the only universe. It's the one in the real space. Okay, this looks like empty space, but we know that this empty space is full of dust and all kinds of little stuff that might still be floating around in there. That there's lots of nuance in this big picture space. But then when you get on the really tiny world, that's where empty space becomes empty. And that's when the forces are real, in the sense that they're interacting strong between the elements. And there's no confusion based on the fact that the light is spread or all this other kind. The inverse square law doesn't even take effect in some cases. But the little universe is the only universe. That's the universe in the real empty space. That's where the real distinction between a something bit and a nothing exists. That's where the real black and white is. And there's only that black and white. And when you have a whole bunch of it, then you make this other universe that can duplicate some of the function in the sense that it can create clumps, and clumps can interact with each other. But the clumps aren't going to be interacting exactly the same, because these are clumps with collected force that the other clumps in the small universe, the force affects them differently. The force doesn't, what's the word for when you make something bigger? It doesn't expand with the same consistent rules.
But now we know at a fundamental level things.
So now we know, so this is how they always say it, now we know, instead of saying, look, it's our theory, and most of us agree, or some kind of crap like that, and then make some statement about your evidence. See, I mean, you could say the evidence for evolution is overwhelming as a theory of origin of life on Earth. It's an overwhelming volume of evidence for that theory. Now, what they know, they don't have that overwhelming volume of evidence. They have tiny shreds of evidence, tiny little bits, and they've drawn these conclusions. So it's just so wrong for them to say, we now know. They don't know this, okay? They've assumed it. So they should have to say, to be fair, to be good scientists, they say, we have all assumed and presumed. We have all judged based on scant evidence, because that's what they've in fact done. They've made judgments based on scant evidence.
Are a lot more fuzzy. Because we've discovered a revolutionary new set.
We discovered, we did this, we did that, we. First, this we stuff is just so freaking evil. You know, because they didn't do any of that discovery stuff. And again, it's almost insulting to the few good scientists like Newton, who didn't step way beyond their evidence and draw all these conclusions and start talking about what they didn't know for sure, as if they didn't, if it was the same thing as the stuff they could assert with a confidence. Newton asserted the inverse square law with confidence because he had evidence to support it.
Of laws that have completely transformed our picture of the universe.
Right, our picture of the universe, as if this is the picture we all have to accept. This silly picture, in my opinion, based on little tiny shreds of little crappy, weak evidence.
From outer space to the heart of New York City, to the microscopic realm.
Yes, again, so this is where, again, I would point out that all these other realms are built out of the smaller realm. Just as we as biological organisms, to really understand what we are, we're not even living organisms. Our cells are living things. That's a life form, is the cell. Okay, we're colonies of cells. And all the attributes that we think are important are byproduct or emergent from the collection of those things. So it's the difference between a building and a city. And you don't call the two things the same thing. You don't call building city. They're not the same thing. We're not really, both things can't be alive. The city can't be a building, and the building can't be a city. And we haven't even gotten those distinctions right. Something that obvious.
Our view of the world has shifted. Thanks to
so again, this shift in the view, when in some respects it hasn't, in the sense that it's just wooey religious stuff. And 300 years ago they were arguing about ether existing, and then in a sense these theories have turned into ether theories. So in some sense they've gone back to the past, because clearly bent space implies, if you can bend it, it implies it's a something, not a nothing. Very hard to bend nothing.
These strange, mysterious laws that are redefining our understanding of reality.
So again, strange and mysterious laws. They're not really laws in the first place. They're tendencies. And clearly, what are the tendencies? The idea that matter, photons are affected by close interaction with matter is hardly mysteriously or surprising. It seems logical that there would be a correlation. The closer you get to a material thing, the likelihood that the photon will be influenced in some way doesn't seem intuitively obnoxious. That seems kind of reasonable. The cause, again, is the thing. They say the cause is because photons have all these attributes. And I would argue that the cause is because photons are hitting electrons, and electrons make photons change their direction.
They are the laws of quantum mechanics.
So
Quantum mechanics rules over
there is no rule book of quantum mechanics, and all it would be is every physicist would have a collection of notions that he throws into it. So some would accept Huygens, some wouldn't. Some would say Heisenberg. I think all of them would say Heisenberg. Well, not all. This idea that the photon doesn't have a location, a position. So, but these rules are not defined anywhere. There's not an established list of this is quantum mechanics book. There just isn't. And they all have very, quite dramatically different perceptions. Where new universes are created, or photons can are entanglement. These are not things that are in some sort of rule book. Action at a distance, instantaneous action at a distance. Not all physicists believe that's happening.
Every atom and tiny particle in every piece of matter, in stars and planets, in rocks and buildings.
So again, more just complete exaggeration is to say that, because everything casts a shadow and the edges of that shadow will be fuzzy, that it's doing quantum mechanics. When it's a tiny effect, and the bigger something gets, the less and less the effect is from its overall function. So the bigger I get, the tinier the amount of influence my surface has compared to my substance. Just as if as the aperture gets smaller, it becomes more and more controlling in terms of the fact that anything going through the hole will be more likely to be close to a surface. The same relationship exists in the inverse. So the bigger the hole gets, the fewer photons are affected by the surface. But clearly, any size hole theoretically will have an edge, and that edge will be affected. But it'll be a tiny percentage of the photons that go through the hole. So you don't talk about it like it's the same effect, like everything is affected by it, because the percentage of effect is so much smaller with size.
And in you and me.
See, so they're just trying to make all this personal, like somehow quantum mechanics is fucking with my life. Like there's some sort of quantum mechanical things happening that are, and it's religion. There's every appearance and every fact indicates that I'm as deterministic as this flashlight. That if the on button isn't on, I'm not on. Lots of clearly binary, unmysterious, very direct, very deterministic, very mechanical things that decide my fate. I don't magically get cancer. I don't magically go cross-eyed. I don't magically do anything. There's no quantum mystery to my function. So again, this implication that there is just religious talk.
We don't notice the strangeness of quantum mechanics in everyday life, but it's always there if you know where to look.
So it really isn't. You can't go looking for it. If I make the hole big enough, you're not going to be able to survey the photons, and because there'll be so few of them, it'll be like finding the 5 Americans, I don't know, who eat quarters every day. Out of the whole 300 million people, you know, there's 5 of them that eat quarters every day. You're not going to find them. Yeah, it ain't going to happen.
You just have to change your perspective and get down to the tiniest of scales, to the level of atoms and the particles inside them.
Right, and that won't help you find any of these influences that are affecting you in any way. So again, just more, you know, cross-purpose kind of bullshit. There is no mystery effect on our level. There's no disappearing staircases. There's no warping this and bending that and all this crap that they imply.
Down at the quantum level, the laws that govern this tiny realm appear completely different from the familiar laws that govern big, everyday objects. And once you catch a glimpse of them, you never look at the world in.
Right. So that's all we get is a glimpse. And what they ought to concede is they don't have any huge volume of evidence. They just have these weird effects that they can't automatically say this is what causes it. And they have these certain weird details, you know, in terms of how they've collected knowledge on the subject, but they've never really written down, you know, a good list of what they know about the subject. So they think like the Young experiment with 2 slits was somehow significant, when logically, no, the real significant experiment was Newton's experiment where Newton's rings were discovered. Same exact effect, as the MIT professor would say, exactly the same cause, single slit pattern, double slit pattern, same exact causes. So not a new phenomenon at all, an old phenomenon. And that it can be argued that the double aperture, that the round aperture is a 2-surface experiment when you turn into a slit, because then you're just seeing one version of it. You're not seeing the version going the other directions. But it's Newton's rings. And you could think of it then as a 2-surface experiment, the single slit. And then you could think about, what about the 1 surface? And when that's studied, you can see that that's also what's happening. That's why my shadow is blurry, is because of this single surface that will affect the photons as they go across my surface. So it happens on any surface. It's a surface effect. And that's what all the facts point to, the fact that it's a surface effect. Close to a surface is when this happens, this change in the path. And again, the path change, when we detail it, if we wrote it down, it could be noticed that it's an angle change. It's not a wave change or something. It's precisely at double locations. So, I mean, each bar is exactly the same angular distance from the next bar. So it's just like 3 degrees and then 6 degrees and then 9 degrees and then 12 degrees. It's always proportional, symmetrical. So that this pattern, you know, isn't necessarily have anything to do with anything waving. It just has to do with the fact that the angle of the light changes, which we see with refraction, which we see with reflections. So again, no real hard analysis of the fundamental evidence for the, once you've seen it, you'll never see the universe straight again. Well, only if you fall for the silly explanations that this can't be explained mechanically, when of course it can be explained mechanically. And at minimum, it can be understood that there's a mechanical cause, that it's how close you are to a surface that's causing the effect. The closer a photon moves to a surface, the more likely it's going to do this quantum thing. That is, change the angle of its momentum. That's all that's happening. The photon just changes. It's going this way, and then instead it starts going this way, or it goes this way. Nothing other magical here.
Quite the same way. It's almost impossible to picture how weird things can get down at the smallest of scales.
They have no picture because they really don't have a diagram of a mechanical cause. And you can see that in their Copenhagen interpretation or many worlds and all these crazy interpretations, is they can't draw a picture of it because they don't know what's causing it. They don't understand the mechanics of it. And so they're making up these bizarre, invisible man, super godlike answers for a simple phenomenon.
But what if you could visit a place like this, where the quantum laws were obvious, where people and objects behaved like tiny atoms and particles? You'd be in for...
So let's understand that this whole idea that tiny atoms and particles, so more talk that seems very unscientific, because we kind of know that an atom isn't a particle, that an atom isn't like a softball. It's not a thing. Even a softball is not a softball, right? A softball is a bunch of string wound in a ball and then covered in a leather. I mean, it's not a continuous substance. It's not a particle. It's not like an asteroid or something, or some kind of just rock, or it's not the same stuff all the way through. And that's very different. So, I mean, cannonball is different than explosive shell, for example, or something. They're different things. And you don't just do this lazy talk where you talk about atoms like they're a particle and then talk about the elementary particles like they're something like an atom or something, because they're not. There could be a true difference between something that is a discrete clump that has rudimentary properties and kind of this consistency thing. It's a bowling ball and it just does bowling ball, doesn't do anything else. You have to have bowling ball thrower, and you have to have alley, and you have to have gutters. You have to have lots of, the structure is going to dictate what the ball does, because the ball doesn't do anything on its own. It's just a clump and something that has moving parts, like an atom that has parts and positions. You just don't call the two things a particle and say, there, I've done my job. Not the same thing. A bee and a swarm of bees, or a hive of bees, they're not the same thing. You don't call them the same thing. You don't call a hive of bees a bee.
Quite a show. Here, objects do things that seem crazy. I mean, in the quantum world, there's a sense in which things don't like to be tied down to just one location or to follow just one path.
All right, so this is just all crap. There's just no evidence that anything has more than one location, or that anything follows anything other than one path. There's just no evidence of that. So this is just their stuff made up, just their religion, their God theory. But they have just nothing to defend it with in terms of any volume of evidence. So I mean, entanglement has been proven. No evidence, really. None. Instantaneous action at a distance, no evidence. And this whole Heisenberg argument that somehow the photon is in a shell, but it doesn't have a location until you force it to, until you interact with it. No reason to believe that. It's just a perversion of the simple argument, which is, well, you know exactly where the photon is based on where it lands, as long as it doesn't interact with an electron before it gets there. And what we do know is that light always behaves this way, that it runs in perfectly straight lines at a perfectly consistent speed if you don't put it near matter. But if you put it, if it has to interact with a matter bit, an electron, it won't do that. It'll change its direction. And so the rules are, unless you know the status of that electron, you can't know where it's going to go. Now, the status of the electron will dictate where it's going to go, but you can't see that. But that's what you're not seeing. You're just not seeing the crash. But the crash is going to decide where the photon goes. And so there's no mystery, no need for this whole magical theory that the photons don't know where they are, the electrons don't know where they are, nothing knows where it is. It doesn't have a real place in the universe. It's just woo. No hard evidence for any of this crap.
It's almost as if things were in more than one place at a time.
It's almost as if. Well, it either is or it isn't, first off. And I think the evidence indicates that what are we going to blame? So photons, we know that if it doesn't hit anything, it goes in a straight line and goes from point A to point B in a straight line. We know exactly where it was. At every point, we could diagram its path from point A to point B, and we would be correct. There wouldn't be any ambiguity about where it went. It didn't go to Venus and then go over here. It didn't do any of that crap. And we know because of the straight line and the time factor, the fact that it gets there at the right amount of time. If it went some other path, it would take longer, so we know it didn't go straight. And again, the only time any of this gets mysterious is that we know when it hits an electron that we can't be certain of where it leaves or when it leaves. Both when and in what direction now change.
And what I do here can have an immediate effect somewhere else, even.
So an immediate, same as instantaneous effect. So somehow there's some influence that moves, through something and gets someplace instantaneously. Now, there's no hard evidence for any of this. Just made up woo. Not even. I mean, it's you can't even compare it to like the theory of evolution. I mean, there's so little evidence. There's so much evidence for evolution. Even before Darwin, there was still a ton of evidence for evolution. I mean, babies even then were still born with tails now and then. I mean, you could still make a fair argument that our species were changing. And we could certainly see it in the fact of how we bred domestic animals and food products. We had been doing that for hundreds of years. So we already had pretty hard evidence of this idea that you could change our form fairly easily. It's hardly a bizarre speculation to point out from the evidence that, yes, organisms left out in the wild would tend to move in a certain direction in terms of their shape and form, just as we select on purpose to create things that are more edible. Nature is going to do the same thing. And so there was already a ton of evidence even before Darwin. And that was so much more evidence than any evidence they have for this stuff. And yet they talk about like this is what they know to be true. And they can't know this stuff to be true. They can only assume it to be true, presume it to be true, prejudge based on no evidence that it's true.
If there's no one there. And here's one of the strangest things of all. If people behave like the particles inside the atom, then most of the time, you wouldn't know exactly where they were. Instead, they could be almost anywhere.
So now this almost anywhere, like the particles inside the atom could go to Venus and then come back, and all this nonsense, like there's no need to believe any of this stuff. There's no substantial evidence supporting it, so there's no need to do it. Like, it's not a great explanation. It sounds ludicrous. I mean, this is like somebody saying, it's like the murder trial, and you're going to argue that a UFO did it. You know, an alien species came here and murdered somebody. Now, you could make up that story, and you might be able to put together a few little tiny shreds of evidence, you know, because, you know, there's weird marks, you know, on the ground that could have been created by some kid playing with a stick in the dirt. But you could say, no, it's an alien's footprint. You know, you can make some kind of silly arguments, but they're silly and their evidence is so thin and weak. And that's what they have here. So that's all they're doing. They're sitting here talking to you, and you people fall for it. And they're reasoning with you and saying, look, this is what we know, and this is what they do. And, you know, you can, if you're an honest person, you know how weak their evidence is. It's incredibly weak evidence. And yet you people are buying this mush, this preposterous story, you know, that the atom is made up of stuff that doesn't have a location. When we know in our real world, everything has a solid location. In the big universe, it all has a solid location. The sun isn't vanishing and disappearing, bouncing around someplace. The earth doesn't. Little tiny vibrations are detected, which causes volcanoes and all kinds of stuff on the earth itself. Every little change has an effect. There's no ambiguity in existing. So the evidence is, the volume of evidence is that everything is solid and has a solid position and obeys rigid rules of movement. That's the volume of evidence. And it's a tiny shred of evidence that indicates that, you know, on some small level that we can't see, there's this little magic stuff happening where stuff is blipping in and out of existence. But it's a tiny shred of evidence.
Until you look for them. Hey, I'm gonna have what he's having. So why do we believe these bizarre laws? Well, for over 75 years, we've been using them to make predictions.
Okay, so for over 75 years, they've been using them to make predictions. This is the biggest lie of the bunch, you know, of just somehow they wouldn't be able to have figured out how to do anything if they didn't believe in this nonsense. And it's absolute rubbish. We still would have had computers and microprocessors and all that stuff without any need to have any entanglement theory or any Heisenberg or Huygens crap. You still could have understood the fact that these certain circumstances, like you make a hole very small, the light will get bent. That's a fact. Okay, that's not a subject. The effect isn't what's being argued. They're arguing for causes. The effects are well established. It's their explanation of cause that hasn't been established. So they're taking credit for what our knowledge of effects is capable of creating in terms of invention, and saying if they didn't think of these were the causes, they couldn't know the effects. When no, we knew the effects before you announced the causes, and the effects are what gives you knowledge and how to use it. The effects are what makes you predict the future effect. Knowing that water splashes, okay, when you throw rocks in it, will give you the ability, without knowing why the rock displaces water, will give you the ability to predict that when I throw other things in the water, it will displace water and splash. Clearly, it's the effect that gave you knowledge, not your definition of a silly cause. And so this is just such a lie to connect their silly cause to being some key element in our knowledge that made us capable of inventing or predicting, when it's just absolute crap. Entanglement predicted nothing. None of it predicted anything. The effects make it possible. Knowledge of effects gives you knowledge to create, to invent. Knowledge of causes doesn't.
for how atoms and particles should behave. And in experiment after experiment, the quantum laws have always been.
All right. So again, have always been. No, they haven't been. And there is an experiment after experiment after experiment. There's versions of the same experiment. And as I've pointed out, their versions of the experiment aren't, again, done so poorly that you can point out how, again, they're make the accusation that it's wave interference that causes the pattern with radio waves, when clearly, all right, it can be rationally argued that all that's happening is you're just jamming the signal, and that if you just measured the absolute amount of signal that's actually produced at the different locations, there wouldn't be any pattern. And so it's just, and so they've established a wrong causal explanation because they're not thorough, and they haven't done experiment after experiment. They provide no explanation for why the effect is so much different in the different modalities they expose to it. So in photons, it doesn't even match the mathematical requirement. It doesn't distribute the effect proportionally. It distributes it in bands of light, and they're not supposed to be bands of light. It's just such propaganda.
Right.
So again, they have tiny amount of evidence.
It's the best.
They have the tiny amount of evidence, and they sell it like, oh, look, experiment after experiment for 70 years. It's just so proven, when it really hasn't been proven. Just like a lensing, gravitational lensing, they didn't even repeat the Eddington experiment ever successfully. And now they're making up stories about invisible dark matter creating, fixing all their problems with the math, because their math doesn't make any sense when applied to these images that they say are being caused by gravitational lensing. They don't have a theory for how it's possible in the locations it exists. And so they just create invisible fake mathematical glue matter to fix their errors. I mean, that's not proving over and over. That's not the most reliable and most predictive. You can hardly call it a prediction when you have to create invisible matter to fix your prediction. Your prediction is so far off that you're creating invisible man in the future to compensate for the fact that your prediction is so far off. The invisible man is building special buildings. That's why the buildings are there.
Theory we have. There are literally billions of people.
The only theory we have. No, you didn't give any thought to other theories. You all wanted this woo to be right for some dopey, crazy, and insane reason.
Pieces of confirming evidence for quantum mechanics. It has.
All right, let's do it again. Let's play some of that without interruption, just because it's such propaganda.
Atoms and particles should behave. And in experiment after experiment, the quantum laws have always been right.
Except for the math.
It's the best theory we have. There are literally billions of pieces of confirming evidence for quantum mechanics.
It has passed so many tests of so many bizarre predictions. There's no...
Right. So all this talk. So again, that's Professor Lewin, who does the dopey radar experiment. So this is a guy who knows why do they put the carrier sound tone on when they do the radar experiment? Oh, that's right, because the experiment won't work unless they do tune the frequency. So unless they change the way you do the experiment, or the way you should do it. And they're aware of this. They know what a signal, they know what radio jamming is. Well, what I'm supposed to believe they don't understand how that could be the reason why they can't receive the signal, is because obviously if they're getting two signals at the same frequency, you can't hear either station. They don't know that phenomenon. So this is just such horseshit. The other guy said literally billions of experiments. What? No, there aren't. That's such an insane lie.
Agreement between quantum mechanics and any experiment that's ever been done.
Oh, I mean, just amazing. Again, when the experiment that have been done, in the sense that your lensing math doesn't work, You haven't got the speed right on galaxies. And then when we get done on the small scale, again, your math doesn't predict the right pattern in photons. What's your explanation for why you can't see what slit a buckyball goes through? Obviously, you can. You can bounce photons off of a buckyball, a clump of matter, and see what slit it goes through. Why haven't you done that experiment? I mean, this is just such crap. This fucking propaganda.
The quantum laws become most obvious when you get down to tiny scales like atoms. But consider this. I'm made of atoms.
Again, a preposterous statement in a sense, because obviously it's not obvious at the atomic scale. It's obvious at the scale of electrodynamics. That's where quantum mechanics started. It starts with the photon interacting with an electron. Very small thing interacting with very small thing. Lots smaller than atoms.
So are you. So is everything else we see in the world around us. So it must be the case that these weird quantum laws are not just telling us about small things. They're telling us about reality.
Oh, whatever. I mean, just, you could almost stop there, right? I mean, Jesus Christ. And like they've told us, and like the evidence is, again, this constant effort to keep saying that somehow the evidence is so good. It's like the photons are telling us about many worlds and Copenhagen, and they're just telling us about, oh yes, I am entangled, and I instantaneously react to what happens to my twin brother and all this bullshit. And again, no, the evidence is tiny. It is tiny. The evidence is tiny as a photon. And all this talk, like they've proven it over and over. So anyway, there's very little participation here. So I could just do these as videos instead of live rooms, I suppose. There's no real point, I suppose. So I think I'll just say the hell with it. And move along. 12 viewers. Mm-hmm. Whatever. So, any last chance for any last words or anything? I mean, I really need to get I need to get one of these talking heads to have the guts to be interrogated on this nonsense. This propaganda. Show me some of this voluminous evidence for these silly descriptions of causes. Alrighty then. Until the next time and such.